Even parted, we possess each other. Absent, we are present. Divided, we remain unbroken. These words, penned by the philosopher to his beloved in the 12th century, capture the fierce, unyielding spirit of medieval love, a love that dared to defy kingdoms, families, and even the church itself. Imagine a world where marriage was a transaction, where hearts had to bow to politics, and where love letters were acts of rebellion. Yet in the shadows of castles and monasteries, behind the cold stone of duty, passion burned so brightly that its embers still glow in the pages of history. This is the world we're stepping into today, a world where love wasn't just a feeling but a battlefield, where every stolen glance and secret vow was a triumph against the odds. The Middle Ages were a time of ironclad rules, where alliances were forged in gold, not affection, and where love stories weren't just romantic, they were revolutionary. Think of the courage it took to choose your heart over your crown, to whisper promises in a society that demanded silence. From the tragic tale of End, whose love cost them everything, to the whispered legends of knights and who risked ruin for a single moment of happiness, these stories aren't just relics of the past. They're mirrors reflecting the timeless struggles of the human heart, the fight to love freely, wildly, and without apology. Today, we're unraveling the threads of history to bring you the most extraordinary love stories of the medieval era. These aren't fairy tales with tidy endings. They're raw, real, and achingly human. You'll meet lovers who emperors, outwitted fate, and left behind legacies so powerful they echo through the centuries. Some found happiness, others faced heartbreak, but all of them dared to dream of a world where love could conquer all. So settle in, because this isn't just a journey into the past. It's an invitation to rediscover the unshakable power of devotion, the kind that bends history itself. And who knows? By the end, you might just find yourself asking, would I have had the courage to love like they did if the medieval world was a chessboard of political marriages and cold alliances? Then courtly love was the bold gambit that changed the game forever. Picture this, a world where knights knelt not just to swear fealty to their lords, but to pledge their hearts to, worshiping them like sacred muses. This was the radical essence of courtly love, a cultural earthquake that began in the sun-drenched courts of southern France in the 11th century and rippled across Europe. Troubadours, those wandering poets with lutes in hand and fire in their verses, sang of a new kind of devotion, one where longing was than possession, where a single ribbon from a lady's sleeve could fuel years of poetic inspiration. At its core, courtly love was rebellion disguised as romance. While marriages were brokered like trade deals to secure land or power, troubadours like Bernard whispered a dangerous truth, that love should be chosen, not dictated. Troyes, the literary genius behind Arthurian legends, spun tales like Lancelot and Guinevere, where a knight's greatest battle wasn't against dragons, but against his own heart, torn between loyalty to his king and passion for his queen. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were blueprints for a new emotional world, where women weren't just political pawns, but sovereigns of desire, admired from afar in a dance of stolen glances and coded letters. The rules of courtly love read like a secret society's manifesto. Love had to be clandestine, often forbidden, because its power lay in its impossibility. A knight might spend years proving his worth through deeds and poetry, never daring to speak his feelings aloud. The lady, elevated to near-divine status, could bestow favor with a mere smile or withdraw it with a frosty silence. This wasn't just fantasy. It was a quiet revolution, teaching medieval Europe that love could be an art form, a spiritual pursuit, even a kind of sacrament. Yet for all its idealism, courtly love thrived on tension. The same culture that idolized Guinevere also condemned her. The troubadours' songs might celebrate adultery as the pinnacle of passion, but real medieval women faced ruin for such transgressions. That contradiction between the ideal and the real is what makes courtly love so fascinating. It wasn't just about flowers and sonnets. It was about human yearning crashing against the walls of a rigid society. And here's the astonishing part. We're still living in the shadow of these medieval daydreams. Every time we watch a movie where the hero wins the girl through grand gestures, or read a novel about star-crossed lovers, we're hearing echoes of those troubadour songs. The idea that love should be thrilling, transformative, even a little dangerous, that's their legacy. So the next time you sigh over a romantic ballad or a whispered confession in moonlight, remember, you owe that flutter in your chest to a group of 12th century poets who dared to put the heart above the crown. Among all the love stories that set the medieval world ablaze, none burns brighter or ends more tragically than that of Peter, and a tale where passion and intellect collided with devastating consequences. In 12th century Paris was already a philosopher, drawing crowds of students eager to hear his radical ideas. But when he agreed to tutor the brilliant young niece of a powerful canon named, neither could have predicted the firestorm to come. Their classroom became a crucible of forbidden attraction, where debates about logic and theology melted into stolen kisses and whispered confessions. Here was no ordinary affair. Theirs was a meeting of minds as much as hearts, with matching scholarly brilliance line for line. The stakes couldn't have been higher. As their secret relationship deepened, became pregnant, a scandal that could destroy them both. Desperate to save her reputation, whisked her away to his sister's home in Brittany, where she gave birth to their son, Astrolabe. When they returned to Paris, proposed a solution as shocking as their love, a secret marriage. But ever the free thinker resisted. She knew marriage would cripple's career in the church, arguing famously, what could seem less fitting than to drag a philosopher down to the domestic duties of marriage? Yet love won out, and they wed in secret, a decision that would unravel their lives. Enraged by what he saw as betrayal, exacted a revenge so brutal it still makes readers flinch centuries later. He hired men to break into his home and mutilate him, ensuring the philosopher could never again disgrace his niece. The attack left broken in body and spirit, retreating to a monastery. Heartbroken but resolute, entered a convent at his urging. Their love story should have ended there, buried under vows of chastity and silence. But the most extraordinary chapter was yet to unfold. Separated by stone walls and sacred oaths, they began exchanging letters that crackle with raw emotion and intellectual fire. Even in sleep, I find no rest from you, wrote, her words swinging between fury and devotion. Once so confident in his philosophy, confessed his torment. You alone have the power to undo me. These weren't just love letters. They were manifestos, wrestling with faith, regret, and a bond that refused to die. His voice especially shatters the medieval silence around women's desire, refusing to repent for loving, not as a wife, but as a lover, with all the madness of my soul. Centuries later, their story still resonates because it refuses to fit neatly into boxes of sin or sainthood. They were flawed, brilliant people who loved too fiercely for their world and ours. When their letters were rediscovered in the 17th century, they became a rallying cry for thinkers fighting against the chains of tradition. Voltaire kept a copy by his bedside, while feminists reclaimed as a proto-icon of female intellect. Even today, their names are whispered in university halls and poetry readings, proof that some loves are so potent they outlast even the harshest punishments. What makes their legacy endure isn't just the tragedy, but the triumph of their minds. In a time when women were rarely allowed a voice, letters stand as monuments to her genius, and for all his flaws, left us something revolutionary: the idea that love and reason could coexist, that devotion could be both earthly and eternal. Theirs wasn't just a medieval scandal, it was the first spark of the modern love story, where two souls dare to demand everything from each other, even when the world says no. There's a moment in every great love story when the world falls away, when two people become the only truth that matters. For Tristan and Isolde, that moment came in the form of a simple mistake, a love potion meant for another, swallowed by accident, binding them together with a force neither could resist. The legend, born in the mists of medieval Europe, asks us a haunting question. Can love ever truly be an accident? Or was their passion written in the stars long before that fateful sip? Tristan, a loyal knight sent to escort the Irish princess Isolde to marry his uncle, King Mark of Cornwall, should have been the last man to betray his king. Isolde, destined to be a queen, should never have glanced twice at her husband's nephew. But the potion, whether by chance or some deeper design, ignited a fire that burned brighter than duty, honor, or even survival. What makes their story so gripping isn't just the magic. It's the way their love exposes the fragility of human vows. They didn't choose to fall. They were swept away, helpless as sailors in a storm. And that's what makes their betrayal so heartbreakingly human. Yet here's the twist: the potion wasn't eternal. Medieval texts reveal it wore off after 3 years, leaving Tristan and Isolde with a choice. They could have walked away, returned to their roles, pretended it had all been a spell. Instead, they chose each other again, knowing full well the cost. That's the real power of their story, not the magic, but the way love, once awakened, refuses to be silenced. Their defiance of King Mark wasn't just reckless passion. It was a declaration that some bonds are stronger than crowns. The tragedy, of course, is that their world had no room for such love. Betrayed by friends, hunted by a heartbroken king, their story spirals toward one of the most devastating endings in medieval literature. Tristan, wounded and desperate, sends for Isolde, the only one who can heal him. But when his jealous wife lies, telling him Isolde's ship isn't coming, he dies of grief moments before she arrives. Finding him dead, Isolde collapses beside him, her heart simply stopping. Even in death, they defy convention, buried side by side. Vines grow from their graves, intertwining so tightly they can't be parted. Centuries later, their legend still captivates because it dances on the edge of an unanswerable question. Was their love a curse or the truest thing they ever knew? Composers saw it as transcendent, turning their story into operas where music swells like an unstoppable tide. Poets painted them as victims of fate, while psychologists might call them prisoners of obsession. But perhaps the most enduring interpretation is the simplest. Love, real love, doesn't ask permission. It doesn't check calendars or weigh consequences. It simply is, wild, inconvenient, and worth every sacrifice. So the next time you hear someone say love is a choice, remember Tristan and Isolde. Remember the potion that started it all, and the years they spent choosing each other long after its magic faded. Because in the end, their story isn't about spells or betrayals. It's about the terrifying, glorious truth that once love takes root, no power on earth can truly tear it apart. Of Aquitaine rode into history like a storm, brilliant, unpredictable, and utterly unstoppable. By the time she met Henry Plantagenet, she was already Europe's most formidable woman, a queen in her own right who'd walked away from her first marriage to the King of France with her vast lands intact. Henry, a young duke with fire in his veins and England in his sights, saw in her not just a bride, but a partner who could match his ambition stride for stride. Their wedding in 1152 wasn't just a union of hearts. It was a merger of empires, blending glittering Aquitaine with Henry's rising power. Chroniclers wrote that they moved through court like twin comets, their arguments as legendary as their passion, their laughter shaking the rafters of castles from Poitiers to London. But love in the shadow of a crown is never simple. What began as a dazzling partnership soon curdled into rivalry. Raised in the cultured courts of southern France, where women ruled salons and troubadours sang of equality, chafed under Henry's iron grip. He, a man who trusted no one, least of all a wife whose intellect his barons, began sidelining her from power. The breaking point came when Henry installed his mistress, Clifford, in a palace so lavish it became legend. A slap would never forgive. Yet this wasn't just a marital spat, it was a war of ideologies. Believed queens should rule, not just breed heirs. Henry saw her defiance as treason. The explosion came through their sons. When encouraged their boys to rebel against their father in 1173, she wasn't just nursing a grudge, she was fighting for her vision of empire. Henry's response was brutal. He imprisoned her for 16 years, a queen locked away like a relic in stone towers. But here's the twist that makes their story unforgettable. Even in captivity, his influence never waned. She smuggled letters, advised her sons, and when Henry finally died, she walked free at 67 to rule as regent for her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart. Their love story reads like a cautionary tale written in fire. Medieval poets spun it as a clash of titans, but modern historians hear something deeper, the sound of two people who loved too fiercely to ever live peacefully. Henry, who once raced across continents to win her, spent his last years paranoid she'd outmaneuver him. Who'd shared his throne and his bed, spent decades waiting for revenge. Yet in a strange way, their collision shaped history more than harmony ever could. Their descendants would rule empires, their quarrels redrawing maps. That's the paradox at the heart of their story. Love and power, when mixed, can become a poison or a catalyst. And Henry didn't just leave behind castles and charters. They left a lesson etched in blood and gold. Love might build kingdoms, but only if the crown doesn't crush it first. And perhaps that's why we still whisper their names 8 centuries later, not because they found happiness, but because they dared to want everything, the world and each other, no matter the cost. Mary Tudor knew the price of defiance. As the younger sister of Henry VIII, she grew up watching royal marriages crumble under the weight of politics. When her brother married her off to the aging King Louis XII of France in 1514, she went, but not without extracting a promise. Henry, perhaps moved by her tears, swore she could choose her next husband herself if Louis died. What he didn't expect was for his sister to call his bluff so spectacularly. Louis's death just 3 months later left 18-year-old Mary a widow and dangerously free. While Henry schemed to use her for another alliance, her heart had already chosen Charles Brandon, the king's closest friend, a man whose charm hid a razor-sharp mind. Their love was an open secret at court, but Brandon was no prince, just a duke with a penchant for gambling and a knack for surviving Henry's mercurial temper. For Mary to marry him without permission wasn't just reckless, it was treason. What happened next reads like a scene from a romantic thriller. Under the guise of mourning, Mary persuaded Henry to send Brandon to France to escort her home. Once there, they vanished. Contemporary accounts whisper of hurried vows exchanged in a shadowy chapel, of Mary tossing her widow's weeds aside like shackles. When word reached Henry, his fury shook palaces. Brandon had stolen not just a princess, but a bargaining chip worth kingdoms. The punishment for such audacity. Death was not off the table. Yet here, where the story twists. Brandon, ever the strategist, didn't grovel, he negotiated. Racing back to England ahead of the news, he fell to his knees before Henry, not with excuses, but with an offer. Their marriage could still serve the crown. Mary's dowry from France was staggering, and Brandon agreed to repay every penny in installments. More crucially, he swore loyalty deeper than any alliance could buy. Henry, caught between rage and pragmatism, chose the latter. After exiling them briefly for show, he welcomed the couple back, proof that even the Tudor lion could be swayed by love, or at least by a good deal. Mary's rebellion wasn't just personal, it was political theater. In an era where royal women were human chess pieces, her insistence on happiness sent shockwaves through Europe. Their marriage, though rocky at times, Brandon's eye wandered, and Mary's health faltered, became a quiet triumph. When she died in 1533, Brandon buried her with a monument calling her the fairest, and the most faithful of wives, words that hint at a bond deeper than duty. Their legacy, a crack in the fortress of royal obligation. Future queens like Elizabeth I would point to Mary's story when refusing marriages, proving that once a princess dared to choose, the mold was broken. The Tudors are remembered for their tempers and their tragedies, but in the shadow of the throne, Mary and Brandon wrote a different kind of history, one where love, against all odds, won just enough to matter. Dante was 9 years old the first time he saw Beatrice, and in that single glance, his life split in two. She wore crimson that day, walking through the streets of Florence, a girl of 8, unaware she'd just become the muse of one of history's greatest love stories. They barely spoke, never courted, and by 24, Beatrice was dead. Yet Dante's love for her would outlive empires, shaping not just his poetry, but the very soul of Renaissance Europe. This wasn't romance as the troubadours sang of it. It was something far more radical, a love that refused to be bound by death, time, or even reality itself. In La Vita, Dante's early work, he confesses the trembling awe Beatrice inspired. A mere glimpse of her could leave him weak with ecstasy, his words painting her as less a woman than a miracle, an angel who showed forth the ends of love. When she died suddenly in 1290, his grief didn't fade, it alchemized. Where others might have buried their sorrow, Dante built a cathedral of verse, elevating Beatrice from memory to myth. By the time he wrote the Divine Comedy, she wasn't just a lost love, she was divinity itself, the one who'd guide him through paradise. Here, what makes their story so extraordinary? Beatrice became the bridge between earthly and heavenly love. In the Divine Comedy's most breathtaking twist, she replaces Virgil as Dante's guide through the celestial spheres, her eyes holding all of history's light. Medieval readers gasped at the audacity. A mortal woman, not a saint, leading a soul to God. But Dante was making a revolutionary claim that pure love could be a path to grace. When Beatrice scolds Dante for losing his way after her death, it's not jealousy in her voice, but sorrow that he'd mistaken the vessel for the source. "Look well," she tells him in paradise, "for in my face you'll see what you once loved on earth." This wasn't just poetry, it was theology in disguise. By giving Beatrice the role of divine intercessor, Dante challenged the medieval church's monopoly on salvation. Love, he argued, wasn't just a feeling, it was a force that could lift humanity toward the divine. Artists took note. Painters would later depict Beatrice with golden halos, while composers set her praises to music. Even today, psychologists study the Beatrice effect, how idealization can transform grief into creativity, how longing can become a compass pointing towards something greater. Yet beneath the grandeur lies a haunting question. Did Dante ever truly know Beatrice, or only the idea of her? Some scholars argue he crafted her into a symbol, smoothing away her flaws and quirks until she became pure meaning. But others hear something achingly human in his verses, the way he recalls the precise curve of her smile, the sound of her laughter ringing through Florence's streets. Perhaps that's the real magic of their story. It reminds us that love doesn't need possession to be real, that the briefest encounters can ripple across a lifetime, and that art can be the most faithful lover of all, keeping alive what time would steal away. So the next time you feel a flicker of nostalgia for someone long gone, remember Dante and Beatrice. Remember that love isn't measured in years or kisses, but in what it inspires us to become. And maybe, just maybe, the most enduring romances aren't those that end with happily ever after, but those that never end at all. In an age without telephones or texts, where distance could mean years without seeing a lover's face, medieval couples turned to letters, not just as messages, but as lifelines. These weren't casual notes dashed off between meetings. They were painstakingly crafted works of art, where every stroke of the quill carried the weight of longing. Take Marjorie Brews, a 15th century noblewoman whose words literally changed her fate. When her family demanded a higher dowry from her betrothed, John, Marjorie didn't plead with tears, she wrote. "My heart is heavy," she confessed, "but lighter when I think of you." Her letters, blending vulnerability with quiet determination, softened John's resolve. He married her despite the feud, proving that ink could be mightier than gold. What makes these letters so extraordinary isn't just their beauty, but their bravery. In a world where marriages were contracts and emotions were secondary, putting feelings to parchment was an act of defiance. Lovers developed codes, flower symbols pressed into wax seals, phrases twisted with double meanings, to outwit prying eyes. A knight might sign off as your humble servant while slipping in a line about the rose that blooms unseen, knowing his lady would recognize their secret. But the risks were real. Intercepted letters could mean scandal, exile, or worse. One of Aquitaine's passionate correspondence with her uncle was discovered. It fueled rumors that shattered her reputation. Yet still, they wrote. The physicality of these letters added to their power. Unlike today's fleeting texts, medieval love notes were tactile treasures. Scented with or folded into intricate shapes, they became relics of affection. Some were even stitched into clothing, worn close to the skin like armor against loneliness. And because parchment was precious, every word had to count. Closing to "In whatever corner of the world I die, I leave you my soul" wasn't just poetry. It was a vow etched into something permanent. Centuries later, these letters still pulse with life. Historians tracing the faint brown ink on fragile pages aren't just reading words. They're eavesdropping on whispers across time. When Marjorie's plea to John surfaces in an archive, or a crumbling note from a knight to his lady is found tucked inside a prayer book, we're reminded that love's language hasn't changed. The ache of separation, the thrill of a secret, the desperate hope that paper might bridge the impossible. These are threads connecting hearts across 800 years. So the next time you tap out a quick, thinking of you on your phone, pause for a moment. Imagine sealing those words with wax and trusting them to a messenger who might take weeks to deliver them, knowing each letter could be your last. That's the legacy of these medieval lovers. Not just their words, but their unwavering faith that love could travel any distance, outlast any silence, and defy even time itself. The town of slept under a blanket of stars the night, climbed the garden wall to see one last time. Their love had been a forbidden thing from the start. Two noble families locked in a feud older than the cobblestones beneath their feet. But for 5 precious years, they'd stolen moments like thieves, whispered conversations through lattice windows, hands brushing during feast days when no one was watching, promises sealed with a single kiss. When begged's father for her hand, the answer was a dagger to the heart. Prove your worth or never darken my door again. Left for war with nothing but his sword and the silk scarf had embroidered with their initials. For 5 long years, he fought in the Crusades, turning his grief into battlefield glory while weighted, her letters tied to merchants' carts, her hope fraying with each passing season. Then came the twist of all, her father's ultimatum. If didn't return by her 20th birthday, she'd marry another. The night before the deadline, paced her chambers, listening for footsteps that never came. At dawn, with still no sign of him, she was led to the altar, her vows to another man echoing hollowly through the chapel. But fate wasn't finished with them yet. Hours later, a dust-covered rider galloped into town, had crossed kingdoms in a feverish rush, only to arrive as the wedding feast was winding down. When he found, the sight of her in another man's arms shattered him. "Kiss me just once," he begged, "and I'll leave this life content." Bound by duty but broken by love, refused, medieval honor forbade even that small comfort. Collapsed at her feet, his heart simply stopping. The next morning, as mourners gathered around his bier, slipped through the crowd in her wedding gown. Pressing one final kiss to his lifeless lips, she let out a sigh and followed him into the dark. Their shared tomb in Church of San became a sanctuary for star-crossed lovers. Pilgrims still leave letters between the stone effigies where and lie, their carved hands almost touching. But here, what makes their story cut deeper than even Shakespeare's famous couple? Romeo and Juliet had 3 days of stolen bliss. and had 5 years of waiting, fighting, believing, only to be undone by hours. Their tragedy isn't about haste. It's about time's relentless march, about how the world moves on even when love stands still. Yet in their silence, they speak volumes. The real power of their legend isn't in the dying, but in the living they did before it. Those secret meetings, the scarf tucked under armor, the way letters grew bolder as hope faded, these weren't just steps toward tragedy. They were acts of defiance, proof that even in a world of feuds and forced marriages, love insists on being heard. So when you stand before their tomb, don't weep for their ending. Listen instead for the echoes of what came before. Two hearts that beat as one, long after the world tried to stop them. Medieval artists were masters of the hidden language of love, painting secrets in plain sight for those who knew how to look. Tucked between the gilded pages of illuminated manuscripts and woven into the threads of tapestries, romantic symbols flourished like wildflowers in cracks of stone, tiny rebellions against a world that often policed the heart. Take the humble lover's knot, a seemingly decorative braid looping through borders of manuscripts. To the untrained eye, it's mere ornamentation. But to a noblewoman tracing her finger along those intertwined lines, it whispered of unbreakable bonds, a promise that no distance could sever. Some of the boldest declarations hide in religious art itself. The famous Garden of Earthly Delights triptych might seem like a chaotic moral lesson at first glance. But look closer. Nestled among its surreal scenes are couples exchanging rings under fruit-laden trees, their gestures tender amid the madness. These weren't just warnings against sin. They were covert celebrations of love's sweetness, painted by artists who understood that paradise wasn't just a heavenly reward, but a stolen moment between mortals. Even the unicorn tapestries of the 15th century, ostensibly about the hunt, pulse with romantic subtext. The mythical beast resting its head in a maiden's lap, a symbol of purity, yes, but also of devotion so fierce it would lay down its wildness for love. The real genius of these artists lay in their use of allegory. A falcon perched on a lady's wrist might seem like a simple status symbol, until you learn it stood for a lover held in delicate control. Pomegranates split open to reveal ruby seeds hinted at passion's sweetness, while ivy climbing a castle wall whispered of love's persistence. These weren't just pretty metaphors. They were lifelines for couples separated by duty or danger. A fresco in an Italian chapel might show Saint George slaying the dragon, but the princess he rescues wears a gown embroidered with forget-me-nots, a message from the artist's patron to his absent beloved, immortalized where no censor would think to look. What's astonishing isn't just the creativity of these symbols, but their universality. From the scriptoriums of France to the workshops of Flanders, the same visual vocabulary appears again and again, a silent rebellion across borders. A knight offering a lady a single strawberry, a medieval emblem of fleeting happiness, in the margins of a prayer book. A pair of rabbits nuzzling in the corner of a solemn biblical scene. These tiny acts of artistic defiance remind us that love always finds a way to speak, even when voices must stay hushed. So the next time you see a medieval artwork, don't just admire the gold leaf or the intricate details. Lean in. Look for the hand barely brushing another in a crowd, the shared glance between figures in a stained glass window. Behind every saint's halo and battle scene, there might just be a love letter in paint, waiting centuries for someone to read it. And isn't that the most magical thing of all? That across 700 years, through brushstrokes and embroidery, these artists still remind us, love doesn't need permission to be remembered. It only needs someone willing to see. History books often paint the Middle Ages as a monochrome era of rigid heterosexuality, where anything outside marital unions was erased or punished. But scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find a world far more complex, one where love between people of the same gender flickered persistently, defiantly, like candlelight under a door. Consider the curious case of the medieval monastery, where men sworn to celibacy penned letters so tender they blur the line between spiritual and romantic. Saint of, a 12th century Cistercian abbot, wrote of his friendships with brothers in terms that make modern readers pause. "In your arms I found repose beyond imagining," he confessed to one fellow monk, describing their bond as "than honey." Was this merely the florid language of medieval piety, or something deeper? Scholars still debate, but what's undeniable is the intensity of emotion these men were permitted to express, so long as they cloaked it in the language of divine love. Yet outside monastery walls, the stakes were deadly. Legal codes across medieval Europe prescribed brutal punishments for same-sex relationships, burnings, castrations, public humiliations. In England, the Buggery Act of 1533 made homosexual acts punishable by hanging, a law that would stand for centuries. But here's the twist. These very laws reveal how common such relationships must have been. Why legislate against something that didn't exist? Court records from Venice to Paris tell whispered stories. Two knights sharing a bedroll on campaign, ladies exchanging vows in secret ceremonies, troubadours singing of a love that dares not speak its name, centuries before Oscar coined the phrase. The most heartbreaking may be Sir William, an English knight executed in 1392 for his relationship with another man. His trial transcript survives, a stark reminder that for every who found refuge in the church, there were countless others who paid with their lives. What makes these fragments of history so vital is how they force us to rethink medieval society. Yes, it was a time of persecution, but also of quiet resistance. Artists smuggled subversive symbols into their work, the paired martyrs and Bacchus, revered as Christian saints despite Byzantine texts describing their union as one soul in two bodies. Poets like Leal wrote ambiguous verses celebrating the love that binds like to like, knowing their audience would read between the lines. Even the church's own obsession with rooting out sodomy speaks volumes. You don't hunt what isn't there. Today, historians are piecing together these erased narratives like detectives reconstructing a burned manuscript. Paleographers squint at marginal notes in prayer books, finding scribbles where monks doodled hearts beside another's name. Archivists pore over wills where men left estates to "my most beloved companion," searching for clues in the careful phrasing. It's slow, painstaking work, but each rediscovered story chips away at the myth that queer love is a modern invention. These medieval souls knew all the risks and loved anyway. That's not just history, it's heroism. And perhaps the most radical act we can do now is listen, really listen, to the echoes of their courage. The knight kneels before his lord, sword glinting in the torchlight as he swears an oath that will split his soul in two, to serve his king without fail, and to honor his lady without stain. This was the razor's edge of chivalry, where love and duty weren't just competing ideals, but forces that could shatter a man's honor with a single misstep. Take the haunting tale of Sir Gawain and the Lady of, where Arthur's noblest knight finds himself trapped in a deadly game. The lady, married to a Lord Gawain, is bound to protect, tests him with whispered confessions and stolen touches. Every glance they share is a betrayal, every chivalrous gesture, helping her mount a horse, accepting her embroidered sleeve, a step closer to ruin. Gawain's agony isn't just about temptation, it's about the impossible contradiction at the heart of his code. How can he be both the perfect vassal and the perfect lover when the roles demand opposite truths? For medieval women, chivalry was a double-edged sword. On one side, troubadours sang of ladies commanding knights, hearts like queens, their whims laws unto themselves. Of Aquitaine's court even formalized this in the courts of love, where supposedly judged disputes of romance with more authority than kings. But peel back the poetry, and a darker reality emerges. A knight's devotion often came with strings. His lady's reputation was a fragile thing, her autonomy hemmed in by the very men who claimed to worship her. When the Lady of begs Gawain to keep their secret, it's not just her heart at stake, but her life. One rumor of infidelity could see her cast out, imprisoned, or worse. Chivalry's velvet glove hid an iron fist. Adore women, yes, but only on society's terms. Yet some knights dared to choose love over loyalty, and their fates echo through history like warning bells. Lancelot's affair with Guinevere didn't just cost him Arthur's trust, it shattered Camelot itself. Tristan, exiled and bleeding, died for Isolde with his uncle's dagger still warm. These weren't just tragic endings, they were morality plays for an audience obsessed with order. The message was clear: step outside the lines and the system will crush you. But here's what the bards often gloss over: the moments of rebellion that made the risk worth taking. When Troyes wrote of Lancelot crawling over a sword bridge to rescue Guinevere, bloody and humiliated, he wasn't just spinning adventure. He was showing a knight so consumed by love that he'd sacrifice his dignity, his safety, even his very identity as a warrior. That's the paradox. Chivalry's strict rules birthed some of history's most radical acts of devotion. Which brings us to the question that haunts every romance, medieval or modern. Can true love flourish within rigid systems? The troubadours said yes, that constraints make passion burn brighter, like wine in a sealed cask. But the trembling hands of real-life lovers tell another story. The medieval wife penning letters to a childhood sweetheart while her politically wed husband snored beside her. The knight carving his lady's initials into his shield, knowing he'd die before speaking her name aloud. Their struggles feel eerily familiar today. How many modern hearts have wrestled with societal expectations, workplace hierarchies, or family pressures? The corporate executive sneaking calls to a forbidden lover isn't so different from Gawain dodging his lord's questions in the Great Hall. Perhaps that's why these old dilemmas still resonate. They remind us that love has always been where the fiercest fights aren't against dragons or rivals, but against the invisible walls of supposed to and can't. And when a knight like Gawain finally cracks, when he whispers his truth knowing it might destroy him, that's not just medieval drama. That's the sound of a human heart demanding to be heard, even if the world insists on silence. The wedding ring slid onto the bride's finger, its cool metal binding her to a future she'd never chosen. Or so the stories would have you believe. But medieval matrimony was far more complex than a simple transfer of ownership. Beneath the surface of sanctioned ceremonies simmered a world of rituals, rebellions, and whispered promises that the era's rigid expectations. Take the ancient practice of hand fasting, where a couple's hands were literally tied together with cloth, a Celtic tradition so potent it survived Christianization. What began as a pagan betrothal ritual evolved into a loophole for lovers, especially in places like Scotland, where marriage by declaration held legal weight. A couple could pledge themselves before witnesses, jump over a broomstick, and be considered wed without a single priest present. The church frowned upon it, but for serfs and servants with no dowries to offer, this was love's great equalizer. Not all defiance was so discreet. In 1262, Marjorie Law, a nobleman's daughter, shocked Lincolnshire by vanishing on the eve of her arranged wedding, only to reappear weeks later, married to a lowly minstrel in a secret forest ceremony. Her furious family dragged the case to court, but the marriage stood. Why? Because Marjorie had mastered the medieval art of subversion. She'd exchanged vows in present tense. I take you as my husband, which canon law considered binding even without parental consent or bans. Such runaway weddings were common enough that bishops issued decrees threatening excommunication for anyone aiding eloping couples, especially innkeepers who rented rooms to suspicious pairs. The bedding ceremony, often misrepresented as mere crude spectacle, was another flashpoint of tension. After the feast, guests would literally tuck the newlyweds into bed, offering bawdy advice and sometimes staying to witness the union's completion. For peasants, this was practical proof of consummation, vital for property transfers. But noble brides like of Kent turned the ritual into political theater. When she married the Black Prince in 1361, chronicles note she demanded the curtains be drawn after the symbolic laying-in, a small act of privacy in an era that treated women's bodies as public currency. Royal weddings were battlefields of another kind. When 15-year-old Isabella of France wed Edward II of England in 1308, the ceremony cost over £2,000, enough to feed a village for years. The feast featured swans gilded with real gold leaf, while jesters reenacted the couple's future with not-so-subtle fertility symbols. Yet behind the pageantry lay cold calculus. Isabella's dowry included strategic French territories, and her vows were less promises than peace treaties. Contrast this with the quiet resilience of peasant unions, where a bride might offer her groom a loaf of bread baked with her own wheat, or a shepherd's wedding where the aisle was strewn with wildflowers picked at dawn. These fractures in the medieval matrimonial mold didn't just vanish with the Middle Ages. The white wedding dress, a rebellion in itself, popularized by Queen Victoria's break from royal tradition in 1840. The custom of carrying flowers, a holdover from brides who bundled herbs to mask body odor, and some whispered to ward off evil spirits unhappy with the match. Even today's destination weddings echo medieval elopements, trading shadowy chapels for sunlit beaches, but keeping the same spirit of escape. What unites these stories across 8 centuries isn't just the persistence of ritual, but the human refusal to let love be dictated. Whether through a stolen kiss at a May Day festival or a clandestine hand fasting in a cow pasture, medieval couples whispered a truth we still recognize. That marriage is more than contracts or crowns. It's the audacity to say, "I choose you," in a world that insists choices were never yours to make. The story of Paris and Helen should have been ancient history by the Middle Ages, yet medieval poets couldn't resist retelling it, each time twisting the tale to mirror their own era's obsessions with love, honor, and consequence. In the 12th century, took Homer's epic and draped it in chivalric splendor, turning the Trojan War into a knightly romance where Paris didn't just seduce Helen. He won her through courtly devotion. Gone were the fickle gods and political machinations. In Roman, Paris becomes a troubadour in armor, serenading Helen with poetry and risking all for her favor. Their love isn't a selfish whim, but a grand passion, sanctioned by the codes of medieval romance. Even Helen's infamous betrayal is softened. She's not a wanton queen, but a lady torn between duty and desire, her heart swayed by Paris's chivalric perfection. But not all retellings were so forgiving. The 14th century, La Belle Constantinople reframed her as a penitent sinner, wandering Europe in rags to atone for the bloodshed she'd caused. Here, Helen's beauty isn't celebrated. It's a curse, a lesson in the dangers of unchecked passion. What's fascinating is how these versions coexisted. The same woman could be both a romantic icon and a moral warning, depending on which fireside the storyteller sat by. The church's influence loomed large. Sermons often cited Helen as proof that female beauty could topple kingdoms, while minstrels countered with ballads where she and Paris were star-crossed lovers, victims of cruel fate. The medieval obsession with Helen reveals a deeper tension: how to reconcile classical myths with Christian morality. Authors like Guido spliced pagan tales with pious commentary, painting Troy's fall as divine punishment for lust. Yet even in these cautionary versions, Helen's allure proved irresistible. Illuminated manuscripts depicted her with golden hair cascading like a waterfall, her gowns embroidered with flowers, a visual echo of Eve's temptation. Artists couldn't villainize her completely. Her magnetism was the story's engine, the spark that set history ablaze. What's truly remarkable is how these retellings repurpose the past to speak to medieval anxieties. When described Paris and Helen exchanging love tokens, a sleeve, a ring, he wasn't just embellishing. He was grounding an ancient tale in the familiar rituals of courtly love. The Trojan War became a mirror for medieval Europe's own conflicts, where personal passions clashed with dynastic alliances. And Helen, she was every noblewoman who'd ever been bartered in marriage, yet dared to dream of something more. The legend's grip on the medieval imagination wasn't nostalgia, it was reinvention. By grafting old myths onto new values, poets gave audiences a way to grapple with timeless questions. Is love worth ruin? Can beauty be blamed for the wars it inspires? 7 centuries later, we're still asking. The only difference is whose face we cast in Helen's role. Beneath the flickering candlelight of medieval apothecaries, love wasn't just a matter of the heart, it was a recipe. Crushed rose petals mixed with mandrake roots carved into lovers' shapes, dove's blood stirred into wine. These weren't ingredients for a feast, but forbidden formulas scribbled in grimoires, designed to bend fate itself. One 13th century manuscript from Bologna prescribes a chilling ritual. Bury 2 figs, one pierced with the suitor's name, the other with the beloved, then whisper incantations as they rot together in the earth. The logic was simple. As the fruits fused in decay, so too would the target's hearts. But this dark alchemy came at a price. The church branded such acts as love witchcraft, a crime punishable by excommunication, or worse. In 1428, a Parisian laundress named was burned at the stake for slipping a potion of vervain and menstrual blood into a merchant's ale, proving that desperation could turn deadly. What's striking isn't just the brutality of the punishments, but who risked them. Surviving trial records reveal that women weren't the only perpetrators. Knights tucked charms into their armor, a lock of their lady's hair wrapped in parchment inscribed with psalms, while monks secretly crafted philters from honey and dried love letters. Even royals dabbled. Of Castile was rumored to have worn an amulet filled with crushed lapis lazuli, and her husband's sweat to ensure his fidelity. The irony. Many of these magical ingredients, like saffron for passion or apples for fertility, were also common in medieval cooking. The line between kitchen and coven was thinner than a knife's edge. The church's fury wasn't just about superstition, it was about control. Love magic threatened the very foundation of arranged marriages, where alliances mattered more than affection. A successful potion could undo years of political maneuvering with a single sip. That's manuals from the era list, love spells alongside heresy, demanding penitents confess if they'd ever sought to bind another's will. Yet for all the risks, the demand never waned. Cunning women in village squares would slip clients tiny cloth pouches, not charms, tied with 9 strands of different colors, each knot sealed with a lover's name. Fast forward to today, and the rituals have softened, but the longing remains the same. Swiping right on dating apps isn't so different from tossing rune stones to divine a initial. Modern love spells come in subtler forms. Strategic Instagram posts timed to a crush's activity, playlist curation as meticulous as any medieval herbalist's brew. Even the pheromone perfumes marketed today echo the rose oil and ambergris mixtures of 15th century Venice. The difference. Now, if your love charm fails, you might get ghosted, not imprisoned. So here's the question that echoes across the centuries. When love feels like a force beyond reason, how far is too far to tip the scales? Would you whisper a name into a candle's flame if you knew it might work? Or is the real magic, then and now, the courage to love without guarantees? Come what may's voice cracked with raw emotion as he sang of love, like the nightingale in spring, a melody of longing that still echoes through the centuries. The troubadours of medieval Europe weren't just entertainers. They were sonic alchemists, turning forbidden desire into verses so potent they could make queens blush and kings shift uneasily on their thrones. Take's famous Can La Mover, where the sight of a lark soaring joyfully only deepens his despair over an unattainable lady. The reconstructed melody, with its haunting minor cadences, reveals the genius of these performers. They wrapped heartbreak in beauty, making even pain something to savor. But the real revolution wasn't just in the words. It was in the daring act of singing them aloud in royal courts. Imagine the gasp when a troubadour like Daniel addressed his patron's wife directly, calling her his diamond in front of her husband's entire court. These weren't abstract love songs. They were sonic love letters, delivered with the cover of artistic license. The melodies, often built on repeating and close musical phrases, mirrored the cyclical nature of unrequited longing. each refrain a fresh twist of the knife. Modern reconstructions, like those by the ensemble, let us hear how a single vibrating string could convey more desperation than 1,000 whispered words. Then came the women who refused to be mere muses. This so is in feminine defiance. Where male troubadours lamented cruel mistresses, she flips the script, berating her lover for his neglect. I should hate you, yet I can't. Her melody, preserved in a rare manuscript from 13th century Provence, strides confidently where men's compositions often faltered in self-pity. These women sang of love's complexities with startling honesty, the boredom of dutiful marriages, the thrill of secret trysts, even the visceral ache of physical desire. When laments that her lover has stolen my heart, my body, my everything, there's no courtly idealization, just raw, unfiltered hunger. The legacy of these medieval melodies stretches far beyond crumbling manuscripts. You can trace their DNA in the aching melismas of flamenco, the call and response structures of blues, even the tortured love ballads of modern pop. When sings of setting fire to the rain, she's channeling the same hyperbole that used to describe his death from love. The troubadour's greatest trick was making personal pain universal, transforming the specifics of a noblewoman's frown into something every listener could feel in their bones. So the next time you hear a breakup song that makes your chest tighten, remember, you're part of an unbroken chain that began with a lute in a moonlit courtyard and a voice brave enough to say what shouldn't be spoken. Marjorie's neighbors clutched their rosaries when she passed by, her white robes fluttering, her sobs echoing through the streets of 15th century Lynn. Here was no ordinary holy woman. This merchant's wife turned mystic claimed Christ himself visited her bedchamber, not as a distant deity, but as a lover. He took my soul in his arms, she dictated to scribes in her famous book, and kissed me full sweetly, as if we were wed to modern ears. It might sound like poetic devotion, but in Marjorie's world, such intimacy with the divine was dangerous. The local clergy accused her of heresy, townsfolk mocked her as that crying woman, and even her husband grumbled about sharing his wife with heaven. Yet Marjorie's tears, floods of them during Mass, in market squares, at dinner tables, were her rebellion. In an era when women's voices were confined to confessionals, she turned ecstasy into a megaphone. What makes Marjorie's story so explosive isn't just the erotic undertones of her visions, but how they weaponized medieval spirituality. While monks meditated quietly in cells, she performed her love for Christ in public, swooning at the crucifix or bursting into loud songs of praise. When a priest challenged her, she shot back that her ghostly husband had told her to do it, a brazen claim of divine authority that left him sputtering. Her book, the first autobiography in English by a man or woman, reads like a medieval romance flipped inside out. Christ is the knight, Marjorie the questing lady, and their love a scandal that shakes the foundations of her ordinary life. She abandons wifely duties, wears white like a virgin despite 14 children, and roams Europe on pilgrimages, all while narrating her spiritual trysts in vivid detail. The backlash was predictable. Bishops interrogated her, accusing her of faking fits to avoid domestic chores. One furious friar tore his hair out, shouting that her sobs were the devil's work. Yet Marjorie's detractors missed the genius of her strategy. By framing her defiance as divine marriage, she accessed freedoms unimaginable for a bourgeois wife. traveling alone, preaching, veiled as sharing revelations, even negotiating with bishops as Christ's earthly representative. Her mysticism wasn't just passion, it was a passport. She wasn't alone in this holy subterfuge. Across Europe, women like of Siena used bridal mysticism to bypass patriarchal gatekeepers. His music throbbed with nuptial imagery, while described drinking from Christ's wounds like a bride sipping wine. The Church tolerated these visions precisely because they seemed apolitical, until women like Marjorie took them literally. Her insistence that Christ told her to stop having sex with her husband crossed a line. It wasn't just piety anymore, but a threat to the social order. Historians still spar over whether Marjorie was a visionary or a hysteric, a feminist law or a woman crushed by medieval misogyny until her mind broke. But perhaps the truth lies in her own words. Love was my hell and my heaven. In a world that gave women two choices, wife or none, she invented a third, the bride of something no man could control. When she wept, it wasn't just for Christ's suffering, but for every woman who'd ever been told her longing was too loud, too messy, too much. And in that, her tears were the most revolutionary act of all. The parchment crumbled at the edges as Richard the Lionheart scrawled his final plea to of Navarre. If I could send my heart instead of this letter, it would reach you faster. Separated by the brutal currents of the Third Crusade in 1191, their marriage became a ghost story. A king who ruled battlefields but couldn't return to his queen. A coronation robe gathering dust in some forgotten chest. Chroniclers wrote of pacing the shores of Sicily, her eyes trained on the horizon where Richard's ships should have appeared, while he languished in an Austrian dungeon, composing poems to her in Aquitaine. Their union, forged to secure an alliance with Navarre, had transformed into something far more dangerous, a love that war refused to let flourish. Warfare in the Middle Ages didn't just part lovers, it weaponized distance. One of Aquitaine's grandson, of Antioch, rode off to defend his principality from Saracen forces. His wife Constance sent him with a silk tunic embroidered with their entwined initials. He died wearing it, the fabric so soaked in blood that when his body was recovered, Constance reportedly fainted at the sight. Such relics, bloodied garments, rings returned in sealed coffers, became the medieval equivalent of a telegram bearing catastrophic news. But even more heartbreaking were the letters that never arrived. In the archives of Venice, a bundle of unsent correspondence from the 1400s survives, addressed to a sailor named Marco by his wife. The ink is blurred where tears fell, her words growing increasingly frantic. Are you alive? The Genoese took 6 ships yesterday. Marco's fate remains unknown, leaving anguish suspended in time. Yet not all wartime love stories ended in silence. Some logic with sheer stubbornness. Take the astonishing case of John of, a penniless knight who married the heiress to Jerusalem's throne in 1210. When she died in childbirth just years later, their infant daughter became the kingdom's last hope. John, now regent, could have for power, but he spent the next decade defending his daughter's birthright, as if honoring his wife's memory meant preserving the world she'd left behind. His fidelity wasn't just romantic. It was political dynamite, a refusal to let war erase love's legacy. The cruelty of medieval warfare lay in its uncertainty. Unlike modern POW camps with prisoner lists, families often had no way to know if their loved ones were dead or merely missing. This limbo birthed macabre traditions. Widows in Brittany would throw their wedding rings into the sea on All Souls' Day, while German knights, wives wore black veils for exactly 1 year and a day before remarrying, a stopwatch on grief. The Church, ever pragmatic, even developed a loophole called absence in peril of death, allowing women to remarry if their husbands vanished in battle zones. What binds these stories to modern wartime romances isn't just the pain of separation, but the surreal intimacy of letters penned in foxholes. A crusader's plea to remember me in the garden where we last walked mirrors the emails sent from Kabul or Kiev today, where time compresses into urgent declarations. The difference? Medieval lovers lacked the mercy of instant updates. A wife might mourn for years before learning her husband had fallen at Acre, or his final words carried home by a stranger with blood-stained boots. Perhaps that's why these echoes of the past still haunt us. They remind us that love under siege doesn't need grand gestures, just the stubborn refusal to let go. Whether it's a queen preserving her absent husband's seal or a soldier's sweetheart pressing wildflowers between Psalter pages, the message is the same. War may dictate where bodies go, but hearts chart their own defiant courses. And sometimes, against all odds, they find their way home. In the bustling markets of medieval Europe, between the spice merchants and the armorers, you'd find a far more clandestine trade. Love, brokered like silk or salt. Professional matchmakers were the algorithm behind medieval marriages, armed not with swipes, but with ledgers detailing dowries, bloodlines, and political alliances. Take the case of a 14-year-old pawn in the chess game of dynasties. When the English envoy arrived to inspect her in 1327, it wasn't her beauty they scrutinized. It was her teeth, her posture, her ability to bear heirs. The contract was sealed before she'd even met Edward III, her future husband. Yet in a twist, that cold calculation, their union became one of history's most devoted partnerships. Edward would later commission a stunning silver-gilt effigy of their stone hands clasped for eternity, proof that even the most transactional unions could bloom into something tender. But for every an Edward, there were a dozen matches that curdled into misery. The archives of Venice's marriage courts overflow with annulment petitions citing irreconcilable differences, coded in medieval legalese. A groom discovering his bride's dowry was half the promised amount, or a bride weeping that her husband's portrait had been painted with excessive charity. Matchmakers walked a razor's edge, overpromise, and they risked their reputations, and they might face a nobleman's wrath. One Florentine broker, Sir, kept meticulous diaries of his failures, including a match where the bride eloped with a stable boy days before the wedding, leaving him to refund the groom's family 600 florins out of pocket. What's fascinating is how medieval matchmaking mirrored modern dating apps in unexpected ways. Tapestries served as profile pictures, heraldic crests replaced bios, and instead of super likes, suitors sent token gifts, a jeweled girdle, a trained falcon. The language of courtship even shared eerily similar tropes. A 12th century matchmaker's pitch of excellent stock, skilled in needlework, and possessed of a cheerful disposition wouldn't be out of place on today's elite matchmaking services. The key difference: swiping left could start a war. When the Duke of Burgundy rejected a proposed match with a French princess in 1420, The insult sparked a conflict that dragged on for years. Yet beneath the ledgers and treaties, human hearts kept their own counsel. The letters of Marjorie reveal how even the most pragmatic brides carved out spaces for intimacy. After her arranged marriage to Richard, a family steward, she wrote of stealing moments to walk together in the pear orchard, where his words were then the fruit. Such small rebellions hint at a truth we often forget. Medieval people weren't blind to love's pull. They simply understood it as a luxury many couldn't afford. A peasant's daughter might dream of a handsome plowman, but when the harvest failed, marrying the miller's son meant survival. That tension between pragmatism and passion still echoes today. Our algorithms might replace dowry negotiations with compatibility scores, but the central dilemma remains unchanged. Is love a feeling or a calculation? The medievals answered with a painful honesty we often avoid, that it's both and neither, and that the most enduring unions sometimes begin with a contract, only to become so much more. Perhaps that's why effigy still moves us. Not because it's a fairy tale, but because it's a testament to love's stubborn habit of flourishing in the soil, even when planted by someone else's hands. France's quill scratched across parchment in the 12th century, etching stories where women didn't wait to be chosen. They seized love like warriors claiming spoils. In her, fairy tale logic collides with feminist defiance. A knight's wife transforms into a wolf to escape her stifling marriage. A princess demands her lover scale a tower naked to prove his devotion. And a noblewoman curses her cheating husband with permanent impotence. These weren't just fantasies. They were blueprints for resistance, written in a world where women's desires were policed like state secrets. Likely a noblewoman herself, wrapped her subversion in the velvet of courtly romance, but her message was revolutionary. That female passion wasn't a flaw to be tamed, but a force of nature. Fast forward to the raucous world of the Canterbury Tales, and's wife of Bath shatters the mold entirely. With her gap-toothed grin and 5 marriages, of Bath doesn't just challenge male authority, she mocks it. Her famous prologue reads like a medieval stand-up routine, skewering clerical hypocrisy and double standards with body precision. Experience, though noon were in this world, is right for me, she declares, a middle finger to scholars who claimed women needed men to interpret their own lives. What's startling isn't just her sexual confidence, though her claim to have tickled her husbands into submission still shocks, but her economic savvy. She inherits fortunes from each spouse, turning marriage into a ladder of upward mobility centuries before the art of the deal. These voices didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were part of a quiet underworld of female creativity, from the poets of to the visionary mystics like of. Even A Guide for Anchoresses acknowledged women's inner lives with startling nuance, advising solitary religious women to treat their own bodies as tenderly as Christ's bride. The real surprise: how many of these texts survived despite church censors and patriarchal scribes? A single manuscript of might pass through a dozen male copyists, each potentially altering or omitting lines. Yet her heroine's audacity still burns through the vellum. Today, these works read like time capsules of feminist thought. When the princess shapeshifts into a hawk to rendezvous with her lover, it's not just magic. It's a metaphor for how women contorted themselves to claim autonomy. The wife of Bath's insistence that nobility comes from character, not bloodline, predates modern class critiques by 600 years. Scholars have shown how these texts used humor, fantasy, and even piety as Trojan horses, smuggling radical ideas into acceptable forms. So why does this matter now? Because every time we assume medieval women were passive victims of their era, we erase their ingenuity. These writers weaponized the very stereotypes meant to silence them: the mystical virgin, the lusty widow, the pious wife, to carve out spaces for complex humanity. They remind us that resistance isn't always a battle cry. Sometimes it's a fairy tale whispered at a spinning wheel, a joke laughed too loudly at a tavern, or a prayer that sounds like devotion but tastes like rebellion. The next time someone calls or France ahead of their time, correct them. They were exactly of their time, just a part we've been taught to overlook. And that oversight, it's our loss. The golden halos of medieval Madonnas didn't just adorn church frescoes, they cast long shadows over every woman's life. Artists like Giotto and Fra Angelico painted the Virgin Mary with impossible perfection. Eyes downcast, hands folded, a serenity untouched by human desire. This wasn't just art, it was a mandate. Sermons thundered from pulpits, extolling Mary's inviolate purity as the standard against which all women would be judged. Yet in the same breath, priests held up Mary Magdalene, the repentant prostitute turned saint, as proof that even the fallen could be redeemed. This dizzying duality left medieval women navigating an impossible tightrope. Too much passion risked damnation, but too little coldness might brand them unnatural. The 13th century handbook Dives and Pauper put it bluntly: a virtuous woman is either a maiden or a mourner for her sins. But here's the twist. Some women weaponized these very archetypes. Mystics like Clare of Assisi deliberately mirrored Mary's humility in their writings, using pious language to secure influence typically to their sex. Meanwhile, like of Provence commissioned private prayer books where Magdalene's flowing hair and ecstatic tears were rendered in scandalous detail, a quiet celebration of feminine desire sanitized as devotion. Even in the cloister, abbesses reinterpreted Mary's obedience as active leadership, arguing that if the Virgin could intercede with Christ, surely her sisters could negotiate with bishops. The tension exploded in medieval art's most subversive motif, the del parto, or pregnant virgin. These rare depictions showed Mary with a rounded belly, her hand resting protectively over the divine child within. To conservatives, they were borderline blasphemous, humanizing the sacred. But to ordinary women, they offered something radical, a Mary who'd known physicality, who'd bled and swelled and ached like they did. Frescoes in Tuscan chapels showed her gripping bedposts during labor, while German woodcuts depicted Joseph boiling water like any anxious husband. This was Mary as both goddess and girl next door, a loophole in the cult of purity. Fast forward to today, and the echoes are uncanny. The Madonna whore complex named. Its roots dig deep into medieval soil. Modern rom-coms still pit the wholesome girl next door against the seductive bad girl, just as troubadours once contrasted the untouchable lady of courtly love with Magdalene's earthy passion. Even the language of redemption lingers. How many love songs promise to save a partner or describe heartbreak as penance? Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy is the quiet rebellion it inspired. When a 14-year-old of Arc cut her hair and donned armor, she wasn't just answering divine voices. She was rejecting the merry mold entirely. And when penned the Book of the City of Ladies in 1405, she included both virgins and former courtesans as citizens, declaring that a woman's worth lies not in her history, but her heart. That radical idea, that love and virtue aren't opposites, but companions, still fights for footing today. So the next time you see a painting of Mary, don't just admire the gold leaf. Look for the cracks in the gilding, where real women scribbled their defiance in margins only history would read. A medieval bestiary wasn't just a book of beasts. It was a mirror held up to the human heart, where every creature carried a secret lesson about love. Take the humble turtle dove, illustrated with such tenderness in 12th century manuscripts. When its mate dies, the surviving bird refuses to ever pair again, circling the skies alone until its own death. Scribes called this the dove's everlasting sorrow, holding it up as the ultimate model of marital fidelity. Then there's the phoenix, that radiant rising from its own ashes, a blazing metaphor for love that defies even death. But the real magic lies in how these allegories blurred the lines between devotion and devotion. When a monk painted a unicorn laying its head in a virgin's lap, was it just a symbol of Christ's purity, or a covert celebration of earthly passion? Bestiaries thrived on this delicious ambiguity. The panther, with its sweet breath said to lure all creatures except the dragon, became an allegory for Christ's love drawing souls, yet courtly poets slyly repurposed it for seduction tales. Even the lowly hedgehog had its romantic moment. Bestiaries showed it rolling on grapes to impale them on its spines, carrying the fruit home to its family. Moralists called it a lesson in providence, but minstrels sang of it as the ultimate romantic gesture, a prickly suitor bringing his beloved the harvest sweetness. These weren't just fanciful tales, they were a cultural shorthand. When a noblewoman received a brooch shaped like two hairs, creatures believed to change sexes and conceive without sin, she wasn't just wearing jewelry, she was flirting with radical ideas about love's fluidity. The church both embraced and feared this menagerie of metaphors. A whale labeled the devil in one manuscript could symbolize dangerous lust, while pelicans piercing their own breasts to feed chicks with blood became Eucharistic love. But when ordinary people adopted these symbols, they often twisted them into something wonderfully subversive. Marjorie, the mystic who wept herself into visions of Christ as her spouse, described their union using bestiary imagery. "He is my eagle, I his nesting branch." Here was divine love, yes, but also shockingly intimate, physical. Meanwhile, troubadours borrowed the nightingale's song, said to pierce its own breast with thorns to stay awake and sing, as code for lovesick poets who'd rather bleed than stop praising their ladies. What's astonishing is how these medieval metaphors still flutter through our love stories today. The lovebirds on a Valentine's card, direct descendants of those inseparable turtle doves. When we say a relationship has risen from the ashes, we're channeling the phoenix's ancient magic. Even the werewolf myth, stripped of its horror, carries a medieval romantic twist. The tales of a knight who transforms into a wolf but retains his courtly manners, his loyal wife safeguarding his human clothes until he can return to her. Sound familiar? It's the prototype for every modern tale of love seeing beyond the beastly exterior. So here's a game to play next time you're people watching. Imagine the couples around you as medieval bestiary pairs. The teenagers holding hands but bickering. Fox cubs, playful now, but destined for cunning partnerships. The elderly couple sharing silent smiles over coffee. Ancient swans, whose loyalty was said to last 60 years. Because the truth these illuminated pages whisper across 8 centuries isn't just about animals. It's about the wild, untamable heart of love itself, always finding new shapes to wear, new songs to sing, new ways to endure. And if that's not magic, what didn't just poison marriages in medieval romances? It unraveled kingdoms. Take the haunting legend of the Knight of the Swan, where a single moment of suspicion spirals into catastrophe. A noblewoman, falsely accused of infidelity by her husband, is cast adrift in a boat with her children, left to perish. Though she's eventually vindicated, the damage is irreparable. The family fractures, the husband dies of grief, and their son grows up haunted by the wreckage. This wasn't just melodrama. It was a grim reflection of medieval society's obsession with honor and the lethal consequences of unchecked envy. The tale's roots stretch back to the 12th century, but its themes feel unnervingly modern. Replace the boat with a viral social media post, and you've got the same story playing out today. Medieval writers diagnosed jealousy as a form of lovesickness, a literal malady thought to cause fever, insomnia, and even madness. Physicians prescribed remedies straight out of a fantasy novel, potions of vervain and charms inscribed with biblical verses, or the bizarre suggestion to drink from a cup carved from a unicorn's horn, which, unsurprisingly, no one could procure. But the most revealing cures came from poets. Troyes proposed a radical antidote: transparency. His lovers, and fakes death to escape her jealous husband, then build a hidden garden where no rumor can penetrate. It's a medieval witness protection program, born from the idea that love can only thrive where suspicion can't reach. Yet jealousy wasn't always. Some troubadours framed it as love's shadow, proof of passion's depth. In Tristan and Isolde, Mark's torment humanizes him, turning a cuckolded king into a tragic figure. Even the church waffled, with theologians like Thomas arguing that zealous love, a controlled form of jealousy, could be virtuous if it protected marital bonds. This duality mirrors modern psychology's split view. Is jealousy a destructive impulse or a hardwired response to perceived threats? Studies show it triggers the same brain regions as physical pain, suggesting its roots run deeper than culture. What makes these medieval stories so enduring is their refusal to simplify jealousy into just a flaw or a virtue. They expose it as a mirror, reflecting the insecurities of the societies that bred them. A knight's fear of his wife's infidelity often says less about her and more about his own terror of losing control. The of France are riddled with these power dynamics, husbands who lock away their wives, not to protect them, but to assert dominance. Sound familiar? It's the same impulse behind controlling partners today, who demand passwords or track locations. Perhaps the most poignant warning comes from the margins of illuminated manuscripts, where artists doodled tiny, satirical scenes. In one, a fox in a monk's robe preaches to geese about fidelity while sneaking glances at a nearby henhouse. The message is clear: jealousy often masks hypocrisy. These stories don't just condemn envy, they dissect it, showing how it festers in silence and thrives on fear. So the next time you feel that old, familiar pang, ask yourself, Is this emotion mine? Or did I inherit it from 8 centuries of storytelling that equated love with ownership? The medievals may not have had therapists, but their tales offer something just as valuable: a chance to recognize jealousy not as a monster under the bed, but as a ghost we've been feeding for generations. And ghosts, as any good medievalist knows, can only haunt us if we keep inviting them in. Death was never the end for medieval lovers. It was merely the next dance. In the flickering candlelight of churches across Europe, the macabre unfolded in vivid frescoes, skeletal figures clasping the hands of the living, pulling them into a waltz that spared no one, king or peasant. But look closer, and you'll notice something unexpected. Amidst the grinning skulls and rotting shrouds, some couples are entwined in tender embraces. A lady's bony fingers still wear her wedding ring. A knight's hollow ribs press against his beloved's tattered gown. This wasn't just a warning about mortality, it was a promise. Love, even in decay, refused to let go. The macabre's most haunting detail: the dead don't drag their partners away in horror, they invite them. In a 15th century mural in Paris's Cemetery of the Innocents, a skeletal lover offers a rose to his living counterpart, their fingers brushing like old flames reuniting. Artists embedded these subtle rebellions against the church's stern warnings about earthly attachments. While priests thundered that souls must abandon worldly loves to reach heaven, the people whispered otherwise. In the ballad The Unquiet Grave, a young man weeps so fiercely at his sweetheart's tomb that her ghost rises, begging him to cease his grief, not because she wants to leave him, but because his tears drench her shroud. "Let the wind blow and the rain fall," she pleads, "for I must sleep a little longer." Here was no tidy moral about moving on, but a raw acknowledgement. Love's bonds could outlast breath itself. The plague years sharpened these themes to a razor's edge. When the Black Death emptied villages, survivors grappled with losses too vast for ordinary mourning. How do you bury a husband, then a child, then your entire family in a single week? Folk tales offered eerie solace. In one widespread story, a widow visits the churchyard nightly to lie atop her husband's grave, until one morning she's found frozen there, her body fused to the earth in a final embrace. Macabre, absolutely. But also strangely comforting, a fantasy that not even the grave could fully part them. War, too, fed this obsession with posthumous love. Battlefields left thousands unidentified, their sweethearts left to wander in hope. The legend of the two lovers of Where Dies moments after kissing her dead beloved wasn't just tragedy, it was wish fulfillment. Better to join them in death than face a lifetime of absence. Even the church's own imagery betrayed this longing. Reliquaries holding saints, bones were often shaped like embracing couples, their silver limbs eternally intertwined. A sacred loophole. If holiness meant union beyond death, couldn't ordinary love claim the same? What's most striking is how these stories refused tidy endings. Unlike modern romances that climax with wedding bells, medieval tales often peaked at the grave and kept going. The macabre's lovers don't get a happily ever after. They get an ever after, period. No resolution, just persistence. That ambiguity leaves us with a question as old as grief itself. Do these stories comfort us or confront us? When the living dance with the dead in art, is it a promise that love endures, or a reminder that not even death can sever our most painful attachments? Perhaps the answer lies in the quiet defiance of a Suffolk peasant's grave from 1321, where archaeologists found a man and woman buried hand in hand, their skeletons refusing to let 8 centuries apart them. No fresco, no ballad, just bones and dirt. And yet, there it is. The simplest, most stubborn truth of all. Some loves don't end. They wait. From the ashes of forgotten letters and the whispers of stained glass romances, one truth blazes brighter than any medieval torch. Love in the Middle Ages was never meek. It was a rebellion etched in ink, a battle cry muffled by castle walls, a flame that refused to be smothered by duty or doctrine. These stories, of mutilated body still penning devotion to, of Mary Tudor gambling her crown for a minstrel's embrace, of Dante spinning Beatrice into divinity, aren't just history. They're proof that the human heart has always its cages, whether forged by iron or tradition. For too long, we've painted the medieval world as a monochrome wasteland of arranged marriages and stoic piety. But peel back the tapestries, and you'll find the vibrant stains of passion everywhere. In the troubadours' lute strings trembling with desire, in the defiant brushstrokes of artists hiding lovers' initials in saints, halos, even in the gruff marginalia of monks doodling hearts beside psalms. These weren't exceptions to the era's rules. They were the cracks where light got in. When Tristan and Isolde chose each other again after the potion faded, or when Marjorie wept ecstatically for a Christ who kissed like a husband, they were asserting a radical idea. That love isn't just a feeling, but a force of nature no law can contain. What binds these tales across centuries isn't their endings. Many are tragic, but their refusal to apologize for longing. The medieval world understood what we often forget, that love's greatest power lies in its impossibility. Courtly love thrived precisely because it was forbidden. The letters between imprisoned queens and exiled knights burned hotter for their secrecy. In our age of swipe-right instant gratification, there's something achingly pure about a devotion that could span years of silence, where a single surviving letter was a relic to be pressed between prayer books and treasured like a sacrament. Dante whispered it best 700 years ago, and his words still rise like incense from the page. Love, which absolves no one beloved from loving. Not kings, not clerics, not even death itself. That's the real legacy of these medieval lovers, not their heartbreaks, but their stubborn insistence that to love is to be gloriously, recklessly human. So tell me in the comments, which historical love story makes your heart race? And if you crave more tales of passion that outlasted empires, don't just stand outside the castle walls. Ring the bell and subscribe. The greatest romances in history are waiting